media.
Andy Coulson, a former editor of the News of the World, was recruited to give the Tories a harder edge with the right-wing tabloids.
Andy Coulson, who's the Director of Communications, is an extremely important part of all this. He's the grit in quite a nice oyster, and he's a former editor of the News of the World and colleague of mine at The Sun, and, sees himself quite rightly as a proud Essex boy, so quite a way away from the privileged walls of Eton, if you like.
Head of Strategy Steve Hilton reflects light onto David Cameron. A small band of men dedicated to reinventing a party and putting it back in power through the image of a young and telegenic leader. This sounds familiar.
The conclusions I reached about Mr. Cameron was that he had studied the New Labour handbook very, very assiduously.
They haven't got a guy with a young family.
His friends say that David Cameron's target voter is the woman he sleeps with.
I could get into a whole lot of trouble for saying this, and this is just total conjecture on my part. She might have voted for Blair. She might not have voted at all. And she would be going to the polls in 2010 thinking, is Cameron the real deal, or should I stick with Brown?
There's an amazing parallel to Blair, and I witnessed both men coming to power in their parties at close quarters. They're both youthful, they're both energetic, they both have young families. They both really believe passionately in power and success, and winning power is the most important thing. They're not bogged down by ideology.
The greatest menace to David Cameron's project for power was the parliamentary expenses scandal.
There have been claims that you put in a claim for moats being...
That is not correct.
Is that correct?
That is not correct.
The best materials that I can find, lead for the roofs, English oak.
Do you know what it's about? Jealousy. I've got a very, very large house. Some people say it looks like Balmoral. It's the photographs. The way they photograph looks like Balmoral. But it just does me nicely.
An Oxford professor who taught politics to the undergraduate David Cameron explains why this was so alarming to the Tory leader.
When we heard about Tory MPs claiming for cleaning their moats, duck islands and all the rest of it, this reinforced the image which the Labour Party would love to recreate of the Tories as the party of the uncaring rich, a collection of Sir Jaspers.
Well, my heart was sinking like, a large concrete block in the Thames. I mean, it was terrible.
It caused, obviously, tensions within the parliamentary party because there is an inward-looking approach which says, you look after your own, you defend people who are in trouble, and there's an outward-looking approach saying you have to understand what the public think about this and what their view is.
Tory MPs were just as mired in the scandal as their Labour counterparts. David Cameron had tolerated the expenses racket for as long as Gordon Brown. The Tory leader had personally claimed large sums for a second home. But by being more nimble than his rival and expressing regret in strong, clear language, he won the political advantage.
This is public money, taxpayers' money. As MPs, we should never forget that simple fact. I don't care if they were within the rules, they were wrong.
He got rid of people who perhaps maybe in another world might have survived, but he got people out of the door partly to show that he was very decisive, partly to show he was strong, and I think in one or two cases it was probably convenient for people to be shown the door so younger, fresher faces could come in.
Has there sometimes been a bit of rough justice in that whole expenses business, whether at the hands of the media or of party leaders? Well, yes, there has, to some extent. But that has been necessary to try to restore some public confidence in the system.
Yet David Cameron hasn't sacked Michael Ashcroft, the billionaire from Belize and party deputy chairman, despite the huge embarrassment he's caused. They've finally been forced to admit that he's still claiming non-dom status to avoid paying tax in Britain on his massive overseas wealth. When you first met him, what was it that attracted you to the billionaire Michael Ashcroft?
I can't remember when I first met Michael Ashcroft, but let's put it in perspective a little bit. I've totally changed the way the Conservative Party raises money. We have broadened the supply of... It's not reliant on just a few millionaires anymore.
If David Cameron becomes Prime Minister, in one sense there will be nothing new at all about that. One school has provided Britain with more Prime Ministers than any other. Some have been impressive, some dreadful. He will be the 19th Old Etonian to occupy number 10.
A large number of the shadow cabinet are from public schools. That would matter less if we weren't living in a period of recession and restriction. And there must be some public worry that the priorities of David Cameron and his colleagues are not necessarily the priorities of less well-off people in the country.
Are you embarrassed that you went to Eton?
No, not at all. I mean, it's a brilliant school.
I don't think it matters that David Cameron is an Old Etonian. After all, he didn't decide to send himself to that school. His parents made that choice. But ever since then, he's been making his own choices. He chose to become a member of the Bullingdon Club at Oxford, which was hardly well known for its sort of sense of social responsibility and concern about the wider welfare of the country or the world.
The point made by Peter Mandelson in Peter's normal feline way is that David Cameron can't be blamed for going to Eton. After all, that was his parents' choice. But he did make the choice to join the Bullingdon Club.
Well, Peter Mandelson, I think, joined the Young Communists when he was at university and went to Cuba to listen to Fidel Castro. And I think that Peter can recognise that the fact that David joined some silly undergraduate club is just typical of the sorts of things we all do when we're letting off steam at university.
David Cameron has been a broadly accomplished leader of the opposition. After 3 election defeats, he has brought the Tories back to the threshold of power. But if he crosses it, the challenges will be awesome. The getting there will be easy compared with the being there. It's July 2010. Within weeks of moving into the Treasury, George Osborne announces an emergency budget. This begins the most severe spending squeeze since 1945. He and Prime Minister David Cameron blame it on the appalling inheritance from Labour.
The budget deficit is a clear and present danger to Britain. If we don't deal with this, we could go into a very serious downward spiral. So we need plans for that, we need to put that in place.
The Conservative responses to the recession and the financial crisis that triggered it have tested their claims to economic competence. Some experts believe it is a test they're struggling to pass. The first big judgment call came when the mortgage bank Northern Rock imploded. The government took the stricken bank into public ownership. The Tories' instant reaction was to denounce the rescue.
Well, after months of dither and delay, we've ended up with this catastrophic decision to return to nationalisation. It's back to the 1970s under Labour.
George Osborne described it as the politics of Fidel Castro. But just 8 months later, much bigger banks were on the brink of collapse, and the Tories were forced to rethink their opposition to bailouts by the state. When the financial system went into meltdown, they were holding their autumn party conference in Birmingham. David Cameron gathered his inner team together for a crisis meeting.
I remember sitting there with David Cameron, William Hague, in David's hotel room in Birmingham and talking through how we were going to handle it as the opposition. But we basically said we were going to support the government. David Cameron went out onto the conference stage the next day with an unscheduled speech.
So I and this party stand ready to help in whatever way is necessary to help the government to do the right thing for the sake of our economy and for our future financial security.
I went down to London to see Alistair Darling and offered our cooperation on the banking legislation that he needed to pass.
On another question of economic judgment, the Tories have been more consistent, repeatedly opposing the government when it increased spending and cut VAT to try to prevent the recession slithering into a depression.
Stability has gone out of the window. Prudence is dead. Labour has done it again. Massive borrowing, rising unemployment, tax giveaways for Christmas paid by tax rises for life. Giving with one hand, taking with another, everything we have come to expect from this Prime Minister.
The Conservatives have concentrated their attack on the size of the government deficit, suggesting they'd cut faster and deeper than Labour.
The Prime Minister told Parliament week after week that the choice was now investment versus cuts. But the public realised that the choice wasn't cuts versus investment. It was reality versus fantasy, prudence versus profligacy, truth versus lies.
Well, I think it's basically right that there is going to be a severe period of retrenchment in public spending. I think all three major parties understand and accept that. I think the problem is it's got to be approached sensibly, not on the basis of political dogma. And at the moment, this idea that we're going to start cutting on day one isn't economically sensible because it takes no account of the state of the economy.
Sir Alan Budd is a former chief economic advisor at the Treasury. David Cameron and George Osborne have recruited him as their guru. Sir Alan warns about the risks of wielding the axe too fast and too deep.
If you go too quickly, then there is a risk that the recovery will be snuffed out and we will go back into a recession. This is what the Americans say, remember 1937.
This is exactly what happened in 1937. This is the Great Depression. And what happens is that you think everything's fine and you tighten too soon. Any attempt to cut public spending anytime soon certainly has the great likelihood it will generate a double dip.
For a while, the Tories made a boast about how fiercely they were going to cut spending. They told the country to prepare for an age of austerity. But then their position in the polls began to weaken. The message was not playing well with swing voters.
Very few governments around the world have ever won an election based upon a budget of austerity. If you're going to put a message of austerity, people are going to realise that there's going to be unemployment. And not just unemployment in general, particularly unemployment of young people.
Worried by those weakening polls, during a visit to the Davos summit, David Cameron dramatically softened his tone. Suddenly, or so it seemed, Tory cuts were not going to be so draconian after all. Isn't the truth that you all got a bit panicked? You talked about age of austerity. Suddenly, the polls didn't look so good. You, certainly David Cameron, got into a panic and went out and said, oh, no, there won't. The George was exaggerating maybe a bit when he talked about these drastic cuts that were coming.
This is complete rubbish. I mean,
how else do you explain this difference and contradiction of messages?
Well, first of all, we have not changed the policy. The pay freeze, when does that start? In 2011. The reduction in the size of Whitehall over a parliament, because that's how long it takes to achieve some of these changes in government. In other words, there is, the things don't all happen the day after a general election, and that was clear from my conference speech, and it's